Welcome back. So let's talk about vaccines.
Some positive news about the vaccine and its effectiveness.
There's new data from the CDC about how well the COVID-19 vaccines keep people out of the hospital.
COVID-19 vaccine efficacy, a topic which has dominated our culture for the past 2 years. We've all heard that vaccines generally protect you against disease, but what do the studies say? And if we go deeper, does getting vaccinated mean you protect others around you? Let's dive into that right now. From Madrid, Spain, recording for Universidad Carlos III, I'm Arunabh Sinha. At this point, nearly 2 years after the release of the first COVID-19 vaccines, we generally know that the vaccines are effective for people who use them.
We find that the direct effect of the vaccine is about an 80% decrease in testing positive for COVID for kids who are vaccinated, which is really interesting and cool because it does match up quite well with the evidence from the clinical trials. And so it's neat to kind of see that real world estimate that does in fact match up with what happened in the clinical trials.
That was Dr. Seth Freedman, a researcher at Indiana University. Dr. Freedman and his colleagues recently released a paper on the direct and indirect effects of vaccines.
So when we talk about the direct effect of the vaccine, we mean, does the vaccine protect the person who has gotten the vaccine from contracting the illness, the infectious disease?
Seems clear. So what about the indirect effects of the vaccine?
The indirect effect asks about whether when a person gets the vaccine, does that vaccine also prevent them from transmitting the virus to somebody else who's potentially not vaccinated? So that's what I mean by the indirect or spillover effects. Does the vaccine actually prevent transmission of the vaccine in addition to simply being infected?
The New York Times COVID-19 vaccine tracker shows us that over 70% of the world's citizens have received a COVID shot. 65% are fully vaccinated. That's a good sign because those people, generally, more protected for their own health. They receive the direct effects of the vaccine. But what about the rest? Do unvaccinated individuals get safety because they're surrounded by vaccinated people? That's a question that Dr. Freedman tried to approach with a unique sample of people.
Sixth graders who are at this time not eligible for vaccines. Sixth graders are almost all unvaccinated. Those that go to middle schools are surrounded by a whole bunch of vaccinated, potentially vaccinated or vaccine eligible peers, while the sixth graders that are going to school in elementary schools are surrounded by entirely unvaccinated peers. So we thought this would be a neat way to compare similar kids. They're all in sixth grade. But some of them are environments with higher vaccination rates among their peers, and others of them are environments with without any vaccinated peers.
Just a quick note here. In the United States, 6th grade is when kids typically turn the age of 12. That's the critical fact here because at the time of the data, the vaccine was only allowed for people aged 12 and above. So if you were less than 12, you weren't able to get the vaccine.
And so if we compare COVID testing rates between sixth graders in these two different types of schools, we can get some sense of the spillover effects of those vaccinated seventh and eighth graders on the unvaccinated sixth grade peers.
So using sixth graders as a sample set means we're a bit limited in how we can use the information from the study. Because the population is so young, the vaccinated group is not highly vaccinated. In the case here, the 7th graders and the 8th graders only had a 25% vaccination rate, which is much lower than the 71% the world is currently at overall. Freedman's findings relate to this fact. He finds that there's no detectable differences in COVID incidence between the 6th graders surrounded by older kids versus the 6th graders surrounded by younger kids.
And so what we find is, at least at that level of take-up, having 25% of your peers vaccinated compared to, say, none of your peers vaccinated, does not provide any measurable protective effect on those that are unvaccinated.
Okay, so we can't say that receiving a COVID vaccine will protect your unvaccinated peers from contracting COVID when the group is just 25% vaccinated. It might provide protection if the group is, say, 80% vaccinated, but we don't really know. Also, keep in mind, this data is entirely from the state of Indiana, so while we could maybe apply it in other situations, we should do so with caution. But back to the point, this protection is often called an externality. Externalities, an economic concept also known as spillover effects, can mean a couple of things regarding vaccines. For example, it could mean that if I receive the vaccine, I will no longer spread the virus to other people. Freedman finds that's not likely the case with the COVID vaccine, at least for kids.
Our paper provides some suggestive evidence that the COVID vaccine, at least among kids, is unlikely to have complete sterilizing immunity, at least.
But we can't definitively say that COVID vaccines have no externalities.
To the extent that there is an externality, we can't rule out that there isn't one. So to the extent that there is an externality, we would have to increase vaccination rates a lot in order to see any potential spillover effects.
A study by Riley Acton in the United States took a look at vaccine mandates in college settings where vaccination rates were really high. They validate that vaccine mandates are helpful to reduce local COVID incidents. Freedman's study complements this by showing vaccines help the individual receiving them. Those are the direct effects. Something I'm always interested in is seeing how can the science inform policy, and here's what Freedman has to say.
The other thing that I think is a good takeaway for policymakers is if you're interested in increasing vaccination rates, maybe we should be doing more to appeal to the own effects, because we do find that the own effects are quite large. It's really beneficial for these kids to have been vaccinated in terms of their own infection rates. So from a policymaker's perspective, they might want to kind of do more to kind of sell that aspect of it as well.
And so we're back to the beginning. The COVID vaccine has been validated by a few sources for its efficacy and effectiveness. We know its greatest benefit is the direct effect, which is to those who receive it. In fact, a meta-analysis released in May of 2022 by Patty Santongo tells us that the vaccine was 83% effective for those who received it. That analysis reviewed over 500 studies on the matter. It's important to keep in mind that COVID positive rates are not the only possible outcome impacted by vaccination rates. Freedman mentioned how he hopes to look into other aspects in the future. For example, he wants to see how vaccination rates impact how a school performs, whether that means students are more absent, perform better with test scores, and other methods. So there's plenty of ways we can evaluate the impact of COVID vaccination rates. For now, Freedman's work shows the COVID vaccine has clear direct effects but little indirect effects. I'd like to thank Dr. Seth Freedman of Indiana University for his contributions to this episode. In addition, the number of scientists focused on this topic gave me much to learn. Thank you for spending some moments as we learn more of what our vast health policy literature has to offer. For Universidad Carlos III, I'm Arunabh Sinha.